Looks fine.
Oh, everything's good. Great. So my name is John Jones. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Denver going into my senior year, majoring in computer science with minors in math and Japanese. I worked on this paper under the close guidance of Dr. Doss of the University of Denver and in collaboration with Reyhan, Duezguen, Dr. Mayer, and Dr. Volkamer of KIT. So without further ado, this is a literature review on virtual reality authentication. So to kind of lay the foundation for the rest of the presentation, I have some technical concepts. So what is VR? What are VR devices used for? And why is VR authentication research so important? So VR is short for virtual reality, and it refers to when users place a VR head-mounted display or their phone over their eyes to simulate being inside of a virtual environment. So this sees many different uses, with the primary use being gaming and some secondary, less used things like retail and military training. So I'm sure a lot of you guys can understand gaming, but as for retail, big online stores such as Amazon and Alibaba have recently been in development of VR malls or shopping centers in which users can go in and purchase select goods from their store, which is very useful. As for military training, as you can see in the picture on the right, it is used for pilot training as well as shooter training. So this kind of leads into why it is important. So as VR continues to grow and spread into more and more sectors, this leads to the need for a more sophisticated security system than we have right now. This is to protect important personal information, such as credit card details or any military plans that may be stored on the VR device. Cool. So moving on, these are some of the potential security risks or attack vectors that most VR schemes are going to be cognizant about in their design, or that could impact the validity of the scheme. So we have an observation attack, a lunch break attack, and a data leak. In an observation attack, the user, it's particularly dangerous because in VR, the user is unable to see what's going on around them. So they might not be aware of any potential observers that are watching them as they are authenticating or logging into their device. So an observation attack is where the attacker just observes the user entering their information, and then at a later time, they try to replicate the user's entry and log into the device. So this is mainly an issue for knowledge-based schemes or schemes where the user is actually entering something in. Next, we have the lunch break attack, in which the user leaves the HMD unlocked and leaves the room. So while the primary user is gone, an attacker would come in, put on the unlocked headset, and access personal information, such as credit card credentials. And this may seem unpreventable, but it is through the process of continuous authentication, in which the instead of just authenticating up front, the user is continually authenticated throughout use of the device. So next we have a data leak, which is mainly a concern for biometric schemes. Since the biometric schemes will be collecting and storing personal information about the user or their personal biometric data on the device. So in this case, an attacker might hack the HMD and steal the biometric data from the user. So this is just a risk for biometric schemes as they do need to collect that personal information. Okay, moving forward into the methods, notably these methods are going to be the steps taken for literature review. So they were article collection from multiple digital libraries, including ACM and IEEE, followed by abstract and full text screening, and finally a thematic analysis of collected papers. So just really quickly, I wanted to emphasize why we took these methods. So we took these methods for the purpose of kind of congregating all the current research on VR authentication into one single spot that new researchers who are new to the field can access and kind of gain general background knowledge on the subject before continuing on with their research. The other goal is to find certain gaps that may exist in the current research surrounding VR authentication. Cool. So The first step was article collection, where we collected articles from ACM, IEEE, Explore, SSRN, Science Direct, and ResearchGate using the keywords authentication in VR, VR authentication, VR user authentication, and authentication VR. Notably, wherever you see VR there, we also substituted virtual reality just to ensure that we collected all articles related to the topic. This yielded a total of 123 articles, which would then be run through abstract and full text screening. Just before that, though, we did initially filter out any duplicate articles or any articles that were patents, as we were not interested in looking at those. So the criteria for inclusion that we were looking for while screening through the abstract and full text were that the article is written in English, provided some form of analysis or technique regarding VR authentication, and it must have been from a peer-reviewed workshop, conference, or journal paper. So after completion, a total of 29 articles remained in our corpus for analysis. Notably, while we are screening through the abstract and full text, we are also taking notes about each individual article, which we will then compare with each other and work towards forming the findings or analysis section. So the notes that we took focused on the type of authentication scheme used, the security evaluation of the proposed scheme, the pros and cons of the scheme, the methods used by the researchers in user studies, and participant details of user studies done. So me and Dr. Doss each individually read through all 57 of the papers, took notes on each of those papers, and then compared our notes together. If there were any discrepancies, they were discussed and solved, so that we were on the same page about everything related to our analysis. From there, we performed collaborative analysis to draw some themes and examine some of the gaps that exist in the research. So that is what I will be discussing in the findings section. So we found that there were three major types of authentication in VR, those being biometric authentication, knowledge-based authentication, multimodal authentication, and gaze-based authentication, being a subsection of multimodal authentication. So just to kind of clear this up right now, out of those 29 papers, 6 of them covered multimodal schemes, with 5 of those 6 being gaze-based schemes. So while multimodal is the big general section, a majority of multimodal research has been focused towards gaze-based research. So yeah, I'm just going to go through each one of these individually and kind of discuss what it is and what some of the pros and cons are in regards to VR authentication for each of these. So starting off, we have knowledge-based authentication. 8 papers covered knowledge-based schemas in our corpus. It's the most prevalent form of VR authentication, given that it is the most usable and easiest to pick up by most users, given its kind of ubiquity in modern culture. Most phones use pins or patterns to unlock, so users are used to it. So it revolves around the entry of pins or patterns or passwords. In other words, something that the user knows, remembers, and then enters into the device. While pins and patterns are used, there are also more complex knowledge-based schemas that have been tested, such as Guraydal's work with 3D Pass. 3D Pass is a very interesting knowledge-based scheme in that the user is placed into a 3D virtual environment, and the path that they take as they walk around and the order of the objects that they interact with actually forms the password. This has been shown to be very memorable and very resistant to observation-based attacks. So some of the pros and cons. The major pro of knowledge-based authentication is how known it is in modern culture and how easy it is for users to pick it up and use it effectively without much work. So that's going to be the main pro for it. The main con is its weakness to observation attacks, in which an attacker, as we discussed, views the entry of the password and later replicates it. The other con is that it cannot support continuous authentication, as in order to re-authenticate, the user would have to be interrupted from their session, which isn't very practical in terms of usability. Great. So moving on to biometric authentication, a majority of papers in our corpus covered biometric schemes with 15 papers in total. So biometric schemes revolve around some form of biometric data being collected from the user, compared to data that was previously collected from the user. If the data matches, the user is authenticated and allowed into the device. So biometric data is something that the user has or something that the user is. So a good example of this is your fingerprint. You have your fingerprint, you are your fingerprint, and it can be used to uniquely identify you. Thus, it is a good form of biometric data. So some types of biometric data collected in VR authentication include electroencephalogram readings or EEG readings, brain waves, body movements / gestures. A commonly used one was actually the motion of throwing a baseball, which I found pretty interesting. Electroocculography, EOG readings, or basically the electrical impulses that travel through your eyes. So a major pro, or two pros of biometric authentication, are that it can support that continuous authentication scheme, and that it doesn't require a lot of work from the user's end. You don't really have to do much for a biometric authentication scheme to work in VR. A con of biometric authentication is that it does need to collect that biometric data and then store it on the device, which some users may not be comfortable with the potential for a data leak. Okay. Then finally, we have multimodal authentication. Basically, multimodal just uses 2 or more separate techniques to authenticate the user. This increases security because multiple checks are in place. Notably, while it can increase security, it can also retain the downsides of the individual techniques used. So if you think about combining a knowledge-based scheme with a biometric-based scheme into a multimodal scheme, it's going to retain the cons or the negatives of biometric and knowledge-based schemes. So I wanted to focus, though, on gaze-based authentication. As I mentioned, it is a very large subsection of multimodal authentication, which combines biometric and knowledge-based techniques to authenticate a user for a total of 5 papers in our corpus. So it revolves around tracking the eye movements and then displaying the point you're looking at on the HMD. You can then use this to enter in a pin or pattern or select objects from a room just by looking at the screen. This has the huge benefit of being completely resistant to observational-based attacks, as an attacker cannot see what's going on inside your VR HMD. In addition to this, a lot of the systems also measure or track the saccades, or the small movements of your eyes as you look around, and you can then be authenticated off of that as well. The cons for gaze-based authentication are going to be pretty similar to both knowledge-based and biometric-based, kind of taking from both of them again, in that it cannot be continuous like a purely biometric system can. And it needs to collect some of that personal information from the user and store it on the device. Okay, moving away from that, now we're going to focus on the security evaluations that were conducted in some of our papers. So in total, 12 of 29 papers conducted some form of security evaluation. So under half, this is relatively low and hopefully can be increased in the future. Now, notably, depending on the type of scheme being researched, the security evaluation is going to be different. So for biometric schemes, equal error rate, or EER, was often used. Equal error rate is a biometric security system algorithm which is used to predetermine the threshold values for false acceptance and false positive rates. Basically, how often are we authenticating the wrong user and how often are we denying authentication to the correct user? Those two things are looked at, combined, and that forms the EER. So an average EER across our biometric schemes was 8.7%, with the lowest being only 1.4%. Now, these percentages are very high for EER and definitely need to be lowered in the future before biometric schemes can really see wide-scale use. Great. So for knowledge base, 5 of our 8 knowledge base papers tested out or used some form of security evaluation to test out their system. For knowledge base schemes, this is generally just going to be a test of one of those attacks that I talked about earlier. mainly observation-based attacks, as once again, that is the chief worry for knowledge-based schemes in VR authentication. So it's good to see that over half of the knowledge-based papers are testing out the security of their system in some way. Great. So moving on into user studies, 26 papers contain at least one user study, with 7 of these containing 2 or more, coming together for a total of 34 studies done across 26 papers. It's good to see that 26 out of 29 papers did at least some form of user study. The average population sizes is interesting to look at. So biometric had almost double, or had double the average population of gaze base and close to 4 times the amount of knowledge base. This is because biometric user studies tended to focus on data set creation, in which a large number of users all came into the lab. Their biometric data was collected to form a data set, and that data set was used to determine values such as EER, which can be used to evaluate the security of the system. So I just wanted to point that out. Here's the gender breakdown of the users across our study. As you can see, there are more males than females included in the population on average. This is something that can hopefully be addressed in further research. The largest gap existed in multimodal research, with there being nearly 3 times the amount of male participants as opposed to female participants. So something that should be addressed in the future. Next, we have the type of study. As I already discussed, we have data set creation. Then we have authentication evaluation. Basically, the researchers are just testing to see whether their authentication scheme works, what errors may exist, what bugs may pop up, what issues users might have, stuff like that. Usability studies are concerned with how memorable a password is, how easy the authentication scheme is for users to adapt to, pick up, and learn, and stuff like that. So these usability studies are going to tend to be done on papers where the scheme that they're testing is much more robust than just like a PIN or a pattern entry. And then finally, we have security evaluation. These were all from knowledge-based schemes, and they just tested out some form of attack, like I mentioned earlier. So finally, in regards to the user populations, we have the elderly population that I wanted to discuss really quick. So across all the studies done, the average participant age was 25, with the oldest participant across all studies being only 57. So this is really young, especially given that research has shown that elderly people who are inside of nursing homes can benefit greatly from VR use in helping them stay active and kind of decrease some of the negative effects that living in a nursing home can have on an individual. So just to kind of clarify what I mean when I say elderly, it's generally going to be people over the age of like 80 or 85. So very, very old people. Great. So yeah, next kind of drawing from that, I'll be going over the implications for future research and some takeaways. So the first takeaway, and it kind of coincides with the last one, is that more robust schemes should be tried in the future, and that multimodal systems are under-researched. So in the future, researchers should strive to try unique and different authentication schemes and continue to push the boundaries and really just test new things and see what can be done. Multimodal systems outside of gaze-based authentication should also be studied, as only one paper really covered a true multimodal-based scheme. Besides, that wasn't gaze-based. Great. So then studies often used the convenient user populations. This should be remedied in the future by striving for more diverse samples. So making sure to get those elderly populations in there, not just using undergraduate students that are readily available. And then just a final takeaway is, once again, those 3 major types of authentication being knowledge-based, biometric-based, and multimodal authentication. Great. So thank you all for your time and coming to watch my presentation. If you would like to contact me or any of my colleagues, I've left our contact information right here. I would like to give a huge shout out to Dr. Doss, who really helped me out with this whole process, as this is my first time ever doing something like this. So huge thank you to her, as well as the people at KIT who helped out. And thank you for HAISA for giving me the opportunity to present.